There was a moment recently, a moment so small, so ordinary, that almost nobody noticed it. But it changed everything. Someone expected you to react. They expected emotion. They expected defense. They expected the old version of you. And for a split second, your body almost followed the script. The tension rose, the words formed, the impulse was there. But then, you didn't. You stayed still, and that stillness was not weakness. It was the final exam. What you didn't realize is that life was measuring you in that moment. Not your intelligence, not your success, not your words, your control. Because elevation doesn't come when you want it. It comes when you can handle it. And the second you didn't break, something closed. A cycle ended. A pattern collapsed. An old identity lost power. You thought it was just a situation. It wasn't. It was a readiness test, and you passed it without applause. Tonight, I'm going to show you exactly what happened in that moment, and why everything is shifting now, not around you first, but within you. Because the test didn't end by accident. It ended because you evolved. 1. Silence is power under control. Let's go back to that moment. The message, the tone, the disrespect, the provocation. You felt it immediately. The surge, the heat rising in your chest, the impulse to respond, to correct, to defend, to prove that you were not someone to be spoken to like that. That impulse wasn't weakness, it was conditioning. Most people are trained to react. React to criticism, react to misunderstanding, react to perceived disrespect. We are taught that silence equals surrender, that if you don't defend yourself instantly, you lose. But here's the truth. Reaction is automatic, silence is intentional, and intention is power. When you didn't react, you did something most people never learn how to do. You paused between stimulus and response. In that pause, you stepped out of reflex and into awareness. That space, that tiny, invisible gap, is where power lives. Because the person who reacts is being controlled by the situation. The person who chooses silence is controlling themselves. And self-control is the highest form of authority. Think about it. Anyone can raise their voice. Anyone can send the paragraph. Anyone can defend their ego. But it takes strength to absorb pressure without leaking emotion. In that moment, you were being weighed. Not by people, by life itself. Life wanted to know, are you still ruled by impulse? Or have you graduated to mastery? Your silence was the answer. And silence is not the absence of strength, it is strength restrained. There's a massive difference between someone who is quiet because they are afraid and someone who is quiet because they don't need to prove anything. One is shrinking, the other is towering internally. When you didn't react, you communicated something powerful without saying a word. I am not moved by this. That statement, even if unspoken, shifts dynamics immediately. Because emotional reactions feed external control. If someone can trigger you, they can steer you. If they can predict your reaction, they can manipulate your direction. But when you didn't react, you became unpredictable. And unpredictability creates psychological dominance. Now, understand this carefully. Silence is not suppression. Suppression is when emotion owns you and you bury it. Powerful silence is when you own the emotion and decide it does not deserve expression. That's maturity. That's evolution. And most people never reach that stage. They live in a loop of reaction. Someone says something, they fire back. Someone challenges them, they escalate. Someone ignores them, they chase. It's mechanical. You stepped out of the machine. You interrupted the loop. In that interruption, something profound happened. You proved to yourself that you are not your first impulse. That realization alone changes your entire identity. Because once you know you can control yourself under pressure, fear loses leverage over you. Conflict loses leverage over you. Even external validation loses leverage over you. Silence becomes your filter. You begin to choose what deserves your energy. And that is the moment you stop living reactively and start living deliberately. The reason everything feels different now is not because the situation changed. It's because you did. When you controlled your reaction, you strengthened a new neural pathway. You trained your nervous system not to explode at discomfort. You built internal stability, and stability attracts elevation. Life does not promote chaos. It promotes composure. That moment of silence was small on the outside, but internally, It was a declaration. I am no longer available for emotional manipulation. That is growth most people will never see in you, but you will feel it. Because once you taste controlled power, you can never go back to impulsive reactions without noticing the downgrade. Silence is not passive, it is precision. It is knowing that not every battle deserves your presence. Not every comment deserves your response. Not every misunderstanding deserves correction. And when you truly understand that, you become untouchable in ways that have nothing to do with dominance and everything to do with self-governance. That was the real test. Not whether you could win, but whether you could remain centered. And you did. That is power under control. And once you master that, life stops testing your emotions and starts trusting your character. 2. Every test is about identity, not outcome. Most people think the test was about the situation. It wasn't. It wasn't about who was right. It wasn't about who had the better argument. It wasn't about winning, losing, explaining, or defending. It was about identity. Every serious test in your life is not measuring the outcome, it's measuring who you are becoming under pressure. Outcomes are temporary. Identity is permanent. When the pressure came, the real question wasn't, will you win this? The real question was, are you still the old version of yourself? That's what life tests. Because life doesn't elevate performance, it elevates identity. You can perform well once and still collapse the next time. But when your identity shifts, your responses change consistently. That moment was not random. It was designed to confront your previous self, the version of you that used to react, defend, chase validation, or prove worth. And the test was simple. Is that still who you are? If you had reacted the old way, nothing dramatic would have happened. The world would have continued. The conversation would have ended. Life would move on. But internally, you would have confirmed something. I am still that person. Instead, you didn't react. And in that non-reaction, you quietly declared, I am no longer operating from that identity. That's why it felt different. Because identity-level decisions always feel heavier than surface-level ones. When you argue, it's surface. When you protect ego, it's surface. When you chase closure, it's surface. But when you choose not to engage because you have outgrown the need to prove yourself, that's identity. Identity determines destiny more than any single event. Your reactions shape your self-image. Your self-image shapes your standards. Your standards shape your future. Most people are trapped in situations not because of circumstances, but because of the identity they keep reinforcing. They reinforce, I must defend myself. They reinforce, I can't let that slide. They reinforce, I need to be understood. And because they reinforce it, they relive it. But when you didn't react, you reinforced something new. I don't need to fight for recognition. I don't need to respond to everything. I don't need to correct every perception. That shift is subtle, but it is transformational. Because when identity changes, your environment begins responding differently to you. Not magically, psychologically. When you move differently, people treat you differently. When you hold yourself differently, dynamics adjust. The old identity attracted certain situations. The new identity filters them. That's why some conflicts disappear after growth. It's not that the world changed overnight. It's that you stopped resonating with the version of yourself that entertained them. Here's the deeper truth. Every difficult moment in your life is less about the event and more about the version of you it's trying to expose. Are you insecure? Are you reactive? Are you seeking validation? Are you controlled by pride? Or are you grounded? Life keeps presenting scenarios until your identity stabilizes at a higher level. When you pass that moment without reacting, you didn't just avoid drama. You demonstrated internal stability. And stability is what unlocks elevation. Because elevation requires consistency. If you crumble emotionally under small triggers, how will you handle bigger responsibilities? If you lose control in minor conflict, how will you carry major influence? Life measures readiness through pressure, and pressure reveals identity. In that moment, your identity did not collapse. That's why the test ended. Because once identity upgrades, the lesson is complete. You are not tested to suffer. You are tested to reveal who you truly are. And when who you truly are becomes stronger than who you used to be, the same tests stop appearing. That's not coincidence. That's graduation. The situation wasn't about them. It was about you becoming someone who no longer needs to react to prove their worth. And that shift will follow you into every future chapter, because identity, once upgraded, changes everything. 3. Reaction feeds chaos, stillness ends it. Chaos survives on participation. It needs engagement. It needs emotion. It needs your energy to stay alive. Most people don't realize this. They think chaos is something that happens to them, but chaos is often something they unknowingly sustain. Every argument requires 2 emotional participants. Every escalation requires 2 egos. Every conflict grows when both sides keep feeding it. Reaction is fuel. The moment you react, you pour energy into the situation. You give it momentum. You extend its lifespan. Even if you believe you are defending yourself, you are still strengthening the exchange. That's how chaos works. It doesn't care who is right. It only cares who keeps responding. But stillness disrupts the cycle. When you didn't react, something subtle but powerful happened. The emotional chain broke. Think about how most situations escalate. One comment leads to another. A misunderstanding turns into a paragraph. A paragraph turns into a confrontation. A confrontation turns into resentment. It builds layer by layer. And it builds because someone keeps responding emotionally, but you didn't. You stepped out of the rhythm, and when one side refuses to escalate, the intensity loses oxygen. That's why things feel quieter now, because chaos without participation collapses on its own. Stillness is not passive. It is strategic. It is understanding that not every fire deserves water from your hands. Some fires die when ignored. Some storms weaken when not resisted emotionally. When you reacted in the past, you may have felt temporary relief. You said your piece. You defended yourself. You expressed frustration. But afterward, did it actually solve anything, or did it create more tension? Reaction often feels powerful in the moment. Stillness feels powerful over time. Reaction satisfies ego. Stillness protects peace. And peace is far more valuable than proving a point. Most people are addicted to reaction. They don't even notice it. Their nervous system is wired to respond instantly to discomfort. They feel triggered, and they act. But you interrupted that pattern. You chose composure over combustion. That decision didn't just protect you from the situation. It strengthened your internal stability. Because here's something most people overlook. Every time you react impulsively, you reinforce emotional volatility. Every time you remain steady under pressure, you reinforce resilience. Resilience builds silently, and it builds through moments exactly like that one. Chaos tests your emotional maturity. It pushes buttons, it provokes, it tempts you to engage. But the highest level of maturity is recognizing when engagement is unnecessary. Not every misunderstanding needs correction. Not every insult needs defense. Not every challenge needs response. When you don't engage, you are not losing. You are choosing not to descend. That's what changed everything, because the moment you stop feeding chaos, you begin starving it. And what starves, shrinks. People who rely on your reaction lose leverage over you. Situations that once drained you lose access to your energy. Patterns that once repeated begin to fade. Why? Because you stopped participating. That's the hidden truth. Chaos often survives because we agree to dance with it. You walked away from the dance, and in doing so, you ended the music. Stillness doesn't mean weakness. It means you understand that your energy is valuable. It means you no longer give your attention cheaply. It means you recognize that your emotional state is more important than temporary validation. When you didn't react, you didn't just avoid conflict. You demonstrated mastery over your internal environment. And when your internal environment becomes calm, your external environment begins adjusting, not instantly, but inevitably, because stable people create stable outcomes. The storm was looking for resistance. You gave it stillness, and stillness is what ends storms. That's why the test ended, because chaos can only test you as long as you keep answering emotionally. You didn't answer, so it had nothing left to challenge, and that is how stillness ends what reaction would have prolonged. 4. You broke a pattern. What happened in that moment was bigger than you think. It wasn't just that you didn't react, it was that you interrupted something old. Patterns run most people's lives, not decisions, not logic. patterns. A certain tone triggers a familiar emotion. That emotion triggers a predictable reaction. That reaction creates a repeated outcome, and the cycle continues over and over. Most people don't even realize they are living in loops. They think each situation is new, but it's not new. It's the same emotional script playing with different actors. You had a script too. There was an older version of you that would have followed it automatically. Maybe you would have defended yourself instantly. Maybe you would have over-explained. Maybe you would have tried to prove your worth. Maybe you would have escalated just to avoid feeling small. That was the pattern. And patterns feel powerful because they feel familiar. But familiarity is not growth. Growth happens when you disrupt the automatic. In that moment, your nervous system wanted to follow the old route. It recognized the trigger. It prepared the response. And you stopped it. That interruption may have looked small externally. Internally, it was massive. Because breaking a pattern is uncomfortable. It feels unnatural at first. It feels like you're not defending yourself enough. It feels like you're letting something slide. But what you were actually doing was dismantling a behavioral loop that had defined you for years. Patterns survive on repetition. The moment repetition stops, the pattern weakens. And when a pattern weakens, identity begins to shift. This is why everything feels different now. You didn't just handle one situation differently. You proved to yourself that you are capable of responding differently in general. That changes self-perception. When you prove to yourself that you can control your impulses, your confidence stops depending on external validation. You begin to trust your restraint. And restraint is strength refined. Understand this clearly. Your future is shaped less by big decisions and more by repeated habits. If you keep repeating emotional reactions, you keep repeating emotional consequences. But if you break even one pattern at the root, the ripple effect spreads. That one moment may prevent 10 future conflicts. It may filter out certain dynamics. It may change how people approach you. Why? Because patterns are energetic signals. When you react the same way every time, people learn how to handle you. They learn how to trigger you. They learn what buttons to press. But when you break the pattern, you become unpredictable. And unpredictability commands respect, not fear. Respect, because people sense that you are no longer governed by reflex. You are governed by choice. That's maturity. Most people stay stuck because they mistake intensity for growth. They think strong emotions equal authenticity. But authenticity is not about emotional volume. It's about alignment. And alignment means your actions reflect your standards, not your impulses. You aligned with your higher standard in that moment. You chose composure over familiarity. And that decision signaled something powerful internally. I am not obligated to repeat who I used to be. That realization is freedom. You are not your history. You are not your past reactions. You are not the person who once needed to prove themselves in every situation. When you broke the pattern, you stepped out of emotional inheritance. You stopped carrying forward a behavior that no longer serves the version of you you're becoming. And that's why the test ended. Because tests often repeat until the pattern breaks. Life will keep presenting similar situations until your response evolves. When it evolves, the repetition stops. You didn't just survive that moment. You rewrote a behavioral script, and when you rewrite the script, you rewrite the trajectory. That's not dramatic, that's psychological truth. You broke a pattern, and that is how transformation actually begins quietly, in a single interrupted reaction that changes everything that follows. 5. Not reacting is a form of selection. Most people think that not reacting means you ignored something. You didn't ignore it. You selected something higher. Every moment of pressure presents two paths: ego or elevation, impulse or intention, reaction or restraint. When you didn't react, you weren't being passive. You were choosing, and selection is power. People underestimate this. They think power is loud. They think it looks like dominance, confrontation, or emotional intensity. But the deepest power is the ability to choose your response consciously. In that moment, you were offered an invitation to argue, an invitation to defend, an invitation to engage in something that would pull you back into an older version of yourself, and you declined. That's selection. Selection determines direction. Every reaction locks you into a path. It keeps you entangled with whatever triggered you. It ties your emotional state to the behavior of others. But when you refuse to react, you untie yourself. You choose not to participate. That is not weakness. That is filtration. Think about it this way. If someone throws something at you and you catch it, you now own it. If you don't catch it, it falls. The same applies emotionally. When someone throws provocation, insult, misunderstanding, or tension at you, reacting is catching it. Not reacting is letting it fall to the ground. You decided not to carry what wasn't yours. That decision protects your energy, and energy is the most valuable currency you have. Where your energy goes, your life expands. If you give energy to conflict, you expand conflict. If you give energy to growth, you expand growth. In that moment, you chose growth over drama. That's a quiet but decisive upgrade. Most people operate from compulsion. They feel something and immediately act. They feel challenged and instantly respond. That's not choice. That's conditioning. Choice requires awareness. You paused long enough to evaluate, is this worth my energy? And when the answer was no, you disengaged. That single decision communicates something powerful to your subconscious. I am in control. Control over your energy builds stability. Stability builds clarity. Clarity builds better decisions. It compounds. Selection also changes your standards. When you refuse to engage in low-level dynamics, you reinforce a new standard internally. I do not entertain what disrupts my peace. And standards shape your future. The more you enforce higher standards through your behavior, the more your environment adjusts. Certain people stop testing you. Certain situations stop appearing. Certain patterns stop repeating because you have signaled what you are available for and what you are not. Not reacting is a boundary, and boundaries are not about pushing people away. They are about protecting your internal state. You are not obligated to respond to every opinion. You are not required to defend yourself to everyone. You are not responsible for correcting every misunderstanding. Selection means you decide what deserves your presence, and presence is powerful. If your attention is limited, then your response is sacred. When you respond impulsively, you dilute your influence. When you respond intentionally, or choose not to respond at all, your words carry more weight when you do speak. That's another hidden benefit. Restraint amplifies authority. Because when you are not constantly reacting, your reaction becomes rare. And what is rare becomes valuable. The moment you didn't react, you selected maturity over momentum. You chose the long-term version of yourself over short-term emotional satisfaction. That's discipline, and discipline builds quiet confidence. You may not have realized it at the time, but in that moment, you were reinforcing an identity. I choose my direction. I am not dragged by triggers. That identity will influence every area of your life. Relationships, work, decisions, goals. Because the ability to select rather than react is transferable. It shows up everywhere. The test wasn't asking if you could handle the situation. It was asking if you could handle yourself. You did. And in doing so, you chose the path forward. Not reacting was not avoidance. It was selection, and selection determines elevation. 6. The test was designed to trigger your old self. That moment wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't just bad timing. It wasn't just someone else's mood. It was precise. Life has a way of testing you at the exact point where your old self used to collapse. Not where you are strong, not where you are confident, but where you used to be reactive, insecure, defensive, or emotionally unstable. That's not punishment. That's calibration. Growth is measured at your former breaking points. The situation was carefully aligned with a previous version of you, the one who would have reacted instantly, who would have needed to explain themselves, who would have felt the urgency to defend their image. That version was waiting to be pulled back out. The test wasn't about the words that were said. It was about whether that version of you still existed. Life will always test the edge of your transformation. If you say you're calmer now, you'll face something that used to make you angry. If you say you're detached now, you'll face something that used to make you chase. If you say you're stronger now, you'll face something that once made you fragile. Why? Because growth without pressure is theory. Growth under pressure is proof. That moment was pressure. It was built to press on your old wounds, to touch your old insecurities, to tempt your old habits. and for a second, your body probably felt it. The tension, the urge, the familiar emotional wave rising. That was your old self knocking. Your nervous system recognized the pattern. It was ready to replay it, but you didn't. And that is where the real shift happened. When you resist reacting the old way, you are not suppressing emotion. You are disidentifying from the outdated version of yourself. That's powerful, because many people grow intellectually, but emotionally, they remain the same. They talk about change, they understand change, but when triggered, they revert. You didn't revert. That's the difference. The test was not trying to destroy you. It was checking whether the old identity still had access to your behavior, and it didn't. Think about how many times in your past similar situations played out the same way. The same emotional spiral, the same argument pattern, the same aftermath. It probably felt predictable. This time it didn't, because you didn't follow the script. And when you don't follow the script loses power. That's why the test ended. Life repeats lessons until behavior changes. Once behavior changes, repetition stops. That's not mystical, it's psychological. The environment mirrors who you are. When you operate from your old self, you attract old dynamics. When you operate from your evolved self, old dynamics feel incompatible. The situation was a checkpoint, a final attempt to see if you would fall back into familiar territory. But you held your ground. You stayed aligned with who you're becoming instead of who you used to be. That's discipline at a deep level, and discipline under emotional pressure is rare. Understand something important. Your old self was built on survival patterns. Defend quickly, react strongly. Don't let anyone disrespect you. Protect your image. Those patterns once protected you, but they are no longer needed at this level. The test was designed to see if you would continue operating from survival or step into stability. You chose stability. That's maturity, and maturity closes chapters. You didn't just avoid conflict. You proved to yourself that the old triggers no longer own you. That realization alone rewires confidence, because now you know something powerful. You are not controlled by your past conditioning. You can feel the trigger and still choose differently. That's freedom, and once you demonstrate that level of control, life has no reason to keep presenting the same emotional trial. The test was designed for your old self, but your old self didn't show up, and that's why everything changed. 7. Energy shifts when you don't engage. Every interaction is an exchange of energy, not in a mystical sense, in a psychological one. Attention is energy. Emotion is energy. Focus is energy. When someone provokes you and you react, you are entering an exchange. You are investing attention. You are contributing emotional charge. You are binding yourself to the moment. That binding creates continuation. The situation lingers in your mind. You replay it. You justify your response. You anticipate the next move. The exchange continues internally long after it ends externally. That is energetic engagement. But when you didn't react, you refused the exchange. And that changed everything. Most people don't realize how much of their stress comes not from events, but from engagement. They keep participating mentally long after the event is over. They stay connected to what disturbed them. Engagement prolongs impact. Disengagement shortens it. When you chose not to react, you did something rare. You severed the emotional loop at its origin. You didn't give the moment enough energy to grow, and growth requires energy. Conflict expands when both sides invest. Drama escalates when both sides contribute emotion. But when one side withdraws energy, the structure weakens. It may not collapse instantly, but it loses momentum. That's why things feel different now, because you stopped feeding something that once fed on you. There is also another layer to this. When you react emotionally, you entangle your nervous system with the situation. Your body stays alert. Your mind stays activated. Your internal state remains unsettled. But when you choose composure, your system returns to baseline faster. That is psychological efficiency. You preserved your internal balance, and balance is magnetic. When you stop engaging in lower-level emotional exchanges, your overall state stabilizes. You become less reactive across the board. Triggers that once consumed you start losing their intensity. Why? Because engagement trains sensitivity, non-engagement trains strength. The more you practice disengaging from unnecessary conflict, the less those conflicts affect you at all. You build immunity. Another truth. Not engaging changes how others perceive you. People sense when they can provoke you. They sense when you're easily pulled into emotional exchanges. And once they know that, they test you more. But when someone attempts to provoke and receives no reaction, something subtle shifts. The dynamic changes. You become harder to read, harder to manipulate, harder to control. And control is often what these moments are really about. When you don't engage, you retain control of your internal state. That control builds quiet authority, authority without noise. The energy that used to leak into conflict now stays with you. And when energy stays with you, it strengthens you. That's why not reacting often feels powerful after the moment passes. You feel lighter, clearer, less drained, because you didn't spend what wasn't necessary. Energy is finite. Every time you react impulsively, you spend it. Every time you replay drama in your head, you spend it again. Every time you escalate, you invest more. You chose conservation, and conservation leads to accumulation. When you accumulate emotional stability, your overall presence changes. You become steady, grounded, harder to shake. And steady people move forward faster than reactive ones because they are not constantly recovering from unnecessary emotional battles. When you didn't engage, you ended an energetic thread. That thread no longer connects you to the tension. It has nowhere to attach. And that detachment is freedom. The shift you feel now is not imaginary. It's the natural result of reclaiming your energy. You stopped participating in something that required your reaction to survive. And without your participation, it lost power. That is how energy shifts. Not through force, but through refusal. You refuse to engage. And in that refusal, you protected your peace and redirected your momentum forward. 8. Discipline is more powerful than dominance. Most people confuse power with dominance. They think power is raising your voice, winning the argument, getting the last word, proving someone wrong. That's dominance, and dominance is loud. But discipline is quiet, and discipline is far more powerful. In that moment, you had the opportunity to dominate the situation emotionally. You could have responded sharply. You could have asserted yourself. You could have escalated and felt temporarily victorious. But you chose discipline instead. Discipline doesn't need applause. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't need to prove strength. It simply maintains control. Dominance is external control, trying to control the situation, the perception, the other person. Discipline is internal control, mastering your response, regardless of the situation. And internal control always outlasts external force. Anyone can dominate when emotions are high, but very few can remain composed when provoked. That composure is not weakness, it is refined strength. Think about the long-term consequences of dominance. When you dominate emotionally, you may win the moment, but you often damage stability. You create tension. You reinforce a cycle of confrontation. Dominance escalates, discipline stabilizes, and stability builds influence over time. People trust disciplined individuals more than dominant ones. They feel safer around them. They respect their consistency. Because discipline signals maturity, you demonstrated something rare in that moment. You proved you are governed by principle, not by impulse. Impulse seeks immediate relief. Principle seeks long-term alignment. When you refuse to react, you aligned with a principle. I will not let temporary emotion dictate my behavior. That is advanced self-regulation. And self-regulation is the foundation of leadership, even if you are only leading yourself. Most people lose credibility not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack emotional discipline. They fluctuate, they escalate, they contradict themselves under pressure. But when you remain steady, you build internal credibility. You begin to trust yourself. That trust becomes confidence. And confidence without volatility is powerful. Discipline also protects your standards. If you respond emotionally every time you are challenged, you lower your standard to the level of the challenge. But when you hold your composure, you maintain your level. You don't descend. You don't match chaos. You don't mirror instability. You stay grounded. That groundedness communicates something strong without words. I don't operate at that frequency. Dominance tries to overpower. Discipline transcends. Over time, dominance exhausts people. Discipline strengthens them. When you chose not to react, you didn't suppress strength. You demonstrated it, because true strength is not measured by how intensely you can respond. It is measured by how much you can withstand without losing alignment. Alignment means your actions match your long-term values. If your value is peace, discipline protects it. If your value is growth, discipline supports it. If your value is stability, discipline enforces it. Dominance may satisfy ego in the moment, but discipline builds character over years, and character determines trajectory. You may not have felt triumphant when you stayed silent, but you reinforced something deeper than triumph. You reinforced integrity. Integrity means your behavior remains consistent even under pressure. And that consistency compounds. The test wasn't asking if you could overpower the situation. It was asking if you could govern yourself. And you did. That's why everything shifted. Because when you move from dominance to discipline, you move from reaction to mastery. And mastery changes your direction permanently. 9. You passed without applause. There was no announcement, no message saying, "Congratulations." No visible sign that something had shifted, no audience acknowledging your restraint. And that's exactly why it mattered. The most important tests in your life are the ones no one sees you pass. Because when nobody is watching, there is no performance. There is no image to protect. There is no applause to chase. There is only you and your character. When you didn't react, no one clapped. No one validated your maturity. In fact, some people may have misunderstood your silence. They may have assumed weakness. They may have thought you had nothing to say. But here's the deeper truth. Growth that requires recognition isn't growth, it's negotiation. If you only act with discipline when people can see it, you're still attached to validation. But when you act with discipline in private, when no one affirms you, that's integrity. Integrity is doing the right thing when there is no reward. That moment tested something deeper than your emotional control. It tested whether you needed acknowledgement to evolve. You didn't get acknowledgement. You evolved anyway. That is rare. Most people are addicted to being seen as strong. They want the visible victory. They want the dramatic moment where they stand up for themselves and everyone understands. But real strength is often invisible. It's quiet restraint. It's unspoken composure. It's choosing long-term peace over short-term ego relief. And because it's invisible, it builds you internally instead of externally. Passing without applause builds self-trust. When you act with maturity and no one notices, you learn something powerful. I don't need external confirmation to know I did the right thing. That realization shifts your foundation. Now your confidence isn't based on how others respond. It's based on how aligned you feel with your own standards. That kind of confidence cannot be shaken easily. External praise fluctuates. External approval changes. External perception is unstable. But internal alignment is solid. In that moment, you reinforced alignment. You didn't perform calmness. You embodied it. And because you didn't get applause, you didn't attach your growth to recognition. You attached it to identity. That's powerful. Understand something important. Life rarely rewards growth immediately. Sometimes the reward is delayed. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's simply the absence of chaos. The real reward for passing that test wasn't validation. It was elevation. You may not have seen fireworks, but you felt something shift. A quiet clarity. A sense of control. A lightness that comes from knowing you handled yourself correctly. That internal shift is worth more than public praise, because applause fades, but identity solidifies. When you pass a test publicly, people celebrate the outcome. When you pass a test privately, you strengthen your character. Character is what determines your future, not applause. There's another layer to this. When you don't need recognition, you become dangerous in the best way possible. You become self-contained. You are no longer performing strength. You are living it. You don't need to prove maturity, you practice it. And when someone no longer needs validation, they become difficult to manipulate, because manipulation often relies on attention and approval. If you don't need either, you can't be easily steered. That's what happened in that moment. You prove to yourself that your growth is not conditional on being understood, not conditional on being appreciated, not conditional on being right in someone else's eyes. You acted from principle, and principle does not require applause. The silence after the moment passed may have felt anticlimactic, but growth often feels that way. It doesn't explode, it settles. And in that settling, something solid forms inside you: self-respect. Self-respect is built when you know you handled something well, even if nobody else acknowledges it. And once self-respect strengthens, you tolerate less chaos. You engage in fewer unnecessary battles. You carry yourself differently. You become less reactive, not because you're suppressing emotion, but because you value your composure more than the temporary satisfaction of reacting. That's evolution. You passed a test that nobody graded, and the absence of applause made it real, because now you know. You don't need to be seen to be strong. You don't need validation to evolve. You don't need recognition to grow. The moment was quiet, but the transformation was not. You passed without applause, and that's why it changed you. 10. You proved you're ready for the next level. Most people think elevation comes from desire. It doesn't. It comes from readiness. You can want growth. You can pray for opportunity. You can visualize the next level. But none of that matters if you're not stable enough to handle it. That moment, the one where you didn't react, was not random tension. It was a readiness check. Life does not elevate instability. It does not reward emotional volatility. It does not hand responsibility to someone who collapses under pressure. It tests first, and the test always appears disguised as inconvenience, a disrespectful comment, a misunderstanding, a delay, a challenge that feels unfair. It looks small, but it's measuring something large. It's measuring whether your internal structure can carry more, because elevation amplifies whatever is already inside you. If you are reactive, elevation amplifies chaos. If you are insecure, elevation amplifies pressure. If you are unstable, elevation amplifies collapse. But if you are grounded, elevation amplifies influence. That's why the test came before the shift. You thought it was just a moment of tension. It was an evaluation. Can you stay composed when provoked? Can you remain steady when misunderstood? Can you hold your identity when challenged? Because the next level requires those exact traits. The higher you go, the more visible you become. The more visible you become, the more you are tested. Not by life alone, but by people. Opinions increase. Criticism increases. Projection increases. If you cannot handle small triggers, you will not survive larger ones. That's why the test came at that exact time. You were close to transition, and transition requires proof of stability. When you didn't react, you signaled something powerful. I am not easily shaken. That sentence alone qualifies you for more, because the next level is not about excitement. It's about responsibility. Responsibility requires control. Control requires discipline. Discipline requires self-awareness. And you demonstrated all three in one moment of restraint. Most people disqualify themselves from growth by reacting impulsively. They sabotage opportunity by exposing instability. They lose credibility by escalating unnecessarily. You didn't. You absorbed pressure without leaking chaos. That's capacity, and capacity determines promotion. Think about any area of life: leadership, relationships, influence, success. Who rises? Not the loudest person, not the most emotional person, not the most reactive person. The steady one, the consistent one, the one who does not fracture under friction. You showed friction resistance, and friction resistance is rare. Life will not expand your territory until your character can sustain it. The moment you stayed silent, you expanded your internal territory. You stretched your tolerance. You increased your composure threshold. That means you can now handle situations that would have overwhelmed you before. And that means your environment can evolve. Elevation is not handed out emotionally. It is unlocked psychologically. You unlocked something, not because you spoke, but because you didn't. There's something powerful about this kind of growth. It doesn't feel dramatic, it feels subtle, but subtle growth is sustainable growth. You don't need fireworks to know you leveled up. You feel it in your reactions, or rather your lack of them. You feel it in your detachment. You feel it in your clarity. You feel it in your refusal to engage with what no longer deserves you. That is readiness, and readiness attracts opportunity naturally. Because when you are stable, people trust you more. When you are composed, your presence feels stronger. When you are not easily triggered, you become reliable. Reliability opens doors. Doors you cannot force open with dominance. Doors that only open when you are prepared. The test wasn't about winning the situation. It was about proving you can carry more without collapsing. And you did. You carried the tension without breaking. You carried the misunderstanding without defending. You carried the provocation without escalating. That's emotional strength. And emotional strength is the foundation of every higher level. You are not stepping forward because you demanded it. You are stepping forward because you earned it. The test ended because the evaluation was complete. You demonstrated composure, and composure qualifies you. The next level doesn't need louder reactions. It needs steadier minds. And in that moment, you proved you are ready. 11. Peace is earned through restraint. Most people chase peace. They try to find it in silence, in distance, in isolation, in escape. But peace is not found. It is earned, and it is earned through restraint. Restraint is the ability to feel the impulse and not obey it. That moment when you didn't react was not just self-control, it was self-respect. Because every time you react impulsively, you trade your long-term peace for short-term satisfaction. You may feel justified, you may feel powerful, you may feel temporarily relieved, but afterward, something lingers. Tension, regret, exhaustion, that's the cost of unrestrained reaction. Peace is expensive, and the price is restraint. When you chose not to engage, you paid that price. You absorbed discomfort instead of exporting it. You tolerated misunderstanding instead of escalating it. You allowed your ego to stay quiet so your stability could stay intact. That is not weakness. That is maturity under pressure. Peace is not the absence of chaos around you. It is the absence of chaos within you. And internal chaos is usually self-created through reaction. The world throws stimuli constantly. Opinions, criticism, misjudgment, provocation. You cannot control what comes toward you, but you can control what moves through you. Restraint filters what moves through you. It prevents external instability from becoming internal turbulence. When you reacted in the past, the situation may have ended outwardly, but internally, it continued. You replayed it. You justified yourself. You thought about what you could have said differently. Your nervous system stayed activated. That is not peace. That is extended disturbance. But when you didn't react this time, something different happened. The moment passed, and it actually passed. It didn't cling to you. It didn't spiral. It didn't expand in your mind because you didn't feed it. Restraint cuts the emotional cord quickly, and cutting cords preserves clarity. There is also a deeper layer here. Restraint builds emotional muscle. The first time you hold back, it feels difficult. It feels unnatural. It feels like swallowing something heavy. But each time you practice it, it becomes easier. Eventually, what once triggered you feels small. That's growth, and peace becomes your default state instead of a temporary achievement. Most people want peace without discipline. They want calm outcomes while maintaining reactive habits. That doesn't work. Calm outcomes require calm behavior, and calm behavior requires restraint. You showed yourself that you can feel intensity without being controlled by it. That realization alone creates stability. Stability reduces fear. When you know you can handle yourself, you stop fearing confrontation. You stop fearing judgment. You stop fearing provocation because you trust your ability to remain centered. And trust in yourself is the foundation of peace. Peace is not silence from others. It is quiet within yourself. And quiet within yourself comes from knowing you won't sabotage your own stability. That's what restraint protects. It protects your standards. It protects your energy. It protects your direction. When you didn't react, you chose long-term serenity over short-term ego defense. That choice compounds. One restrained moment leads to another. One calm decision strengthens the next. Eventually, you build a version of yourself that is difficult to disturb. And when you become difficult to disturb, life becomes lighter, not because problems disappear, but because they no longer penetrate deeply. Restraint is not suppression. Suppression hides emotion. Restraint masters it. You didn't deny what you felt. You simply refused to let it dictate your behavior. That's power refined. And refined power creates peace that is durable. You earned a quieter internal state because you refused to escalate a louder external one. That's how peace is built, not by avoiding pressure, but by mastering your response to it. And once peace becomes internal, nothing external can take it without your permission. 12. Everything just changed because you did. You've been looking for a sign that something shifted. You've been wondering if that moment really meant anything. It did, but not for the reason you think. Nothing magical happened in the external world. No invisible switch flipped. No dramatic event announced your transformation. What changed was you, and when you change, your trajectory changes. Most people wait for life to change before they change themselves. They say, when things calm down, I'll be calmer. When people respect me, I'll act differently. When the situation improves, I'll improve. But growth doesn't work that way. Life adjusts after you do. That moment when you didn't react was a pivot point. It was subtle, but subtle pivots create massive long-term redirection. Imagine a plane changing its angle by just a few degrees. At first, the shift is invisible. The path looks almost identical. But over time, that small adjustment leads to a completely different destination. Your restraint was that adjustment. You altered your emotional direction. You interrupted your pattern. You upgraded your identity. You conserved your energy. You reinforced discipline. You proved readiness. That wasn't just one decision. It was a declaration. You declared, without saying it out loud, I no longer operate from impulse. That declaration rewires your internal system. Your nervous system becomes steadier. Your reactions become slower and more intentional. Your tolerance expands. Your standards rise. And once standards rise, your environment begins adjusting. You will notice it gradually. Certain people will stop testing you. Certain conflicts will fade. Certain dynamics will feel incompatible with who you're becoming. Not because the world transformed overnight, but because you stopped aligning with what drains you. When you don't react, you raise your baseline. And when your baseline rises, what once felt normal now feels unacceptable. You stop entertaining low-level exchanges. You stop defending yourself unnecessarily. You stop chasing explanations. You stop proving your worth to people who were never positioned to validate it properly. That's not arrogance, that's clarity. Clarity changes behavior. Behavior changes outcomes. Outcomes change direction. This is how transformation actually happens. Not through dramatic speeches, not through sudden breakthroughs. Through one controlled moment at a time. You passed that moment, and that pass wasn't symbolic, it was structural. You strengthened your internal foundation. A stronger foundation can carry more responsibility, more influence, more opportunity, more stability. If you had reacted, nothing would have shifted. You would have reinforced the old pattern, the old identity, the old trajectory, but you didn't. And because you didn't, the old path weakened. The version of you that needed to react just lost power. The version of you that can remain composed just gained authority. That's a permanent shift. You cannot unlearn self-control once you've practiced it under pressure. You cannot unknow that you are capable of composure. That awareness becomes part of your identity, and identity drives everything. The future is not shaped by single events. It's shaped by the person you consistently show up as. You showed up differently. That difference compounds. You may not see the full impact yet, but you will, because controlled power creates steady momentum, and steady momentum builds lasting elevation. The test ended because you evolved, and evolution doesn't scream. It stabilizes, it strengthens, it redirects. Everything just changed, not because the world moved, but because you did. And once you move differently, life has no choice but to respond differently. The test ended, you didn't break, and now you're not the same person who walked into it. That's the shift, that's the change. That's the beginning of a new trajectory built on discipline, clarity, and control. So now you understand. It was never just about that moment. It was never just about what was said. It was never just about holding your tongue. It was about who you are becoming. The test didn't end because the situation disappeared. It ended because you didn't show up as the old version of yourself. You didn't react. You didn't defend. You didn't collapse. You held your ground internally, and that's what changed your direction. Most people stay stuck because they keep repeating the same emotional pattern. They call it circumstances. They call it bad luck. They call it people. but its pattern. You broke it. And when you break a pattern, you break a cycle. That's why things feel different now. Quieter, clearer, more controlled. You don't need applause. You don't need validation. You don't need to explain your growth to anyone. You know what happened. You felt it, and that's enough. This wasn't about winning. It was about evolving. The test ended because you did something rare. You mastered yourself. And when you master yourself, life stops testing your reactions and starts expanding your capacity. So carry this forward. The next time pressure rises, remember who you proved yourself to be. Not reactive, not unstable, not easily shaken, disciplined, grounded, ready. The old version would have broken. You didn't, and that's why everything just changed. If this message resonated with you, don't just watch it, apply it, because the next level isn't loud, it's controlled, and now you're built for it.